Yo, what's up, everybody? It's going to be a DOU team building guide. We've kind of planning to do this one for a while. Haven't exactly had the time. As I'm recording this right now, Deoxys attack is still legal. The suspect voting will probably go up uh, tomorrow night, I think. I don't exactly have the timeline memorized, but that's usually how it goes. So I will. This is kind of going to be based on the Deoxys meta, but usually when something comes up, probably particularly in the EV section in regards to speed creep, uh, I will mention the caveat of this is what you do for a Deoxys meta, this is what you would do if Deoxys is not in the tier. Uh, but yeah, I'm kind of planning to go over, first off, maybe some DOU basics. I'm assuming most people already know what DOU is, but I'll have a little section here just explaining the basics. And I'll add chapters in as well, so of course, for the most of you that already know what DOU is, so that's probably why you click on this video or found it on Smogon or whatever. There will be chapters, so you can skip to that. Uh, but yeah, I'll do a brief overview of DOU, um, resources in regards to team building. A bit of, obviously, the main part of this is going to be my approach to team building, strategies and lines I would like to use. Kind of just, there's going to be an EV section, common archetypes that you'd see. We'll look at the samples a little bit and a couple teams in the bazaar, depending on the time. So yeah, hope you enjoy. All right, so first off, what is DOU? For those of you that are unaware, DOU is Smogon's doubles format. Uh, Contrary to singles, you play with two Pokemon at a time. Um, in some ways, it's obviously plays very similar to VGC, the official competitive format. However, of course, you have six Pokemon on each side, and you bring all six, contrary to VGC, where you only pick four of your six Pokemon to bring to a particular game. And so this has a couple of implications for team building. Uh, in VGC, you kind of can get away with having separate cores on your team that don't really function cohesively together. And while you can do that in DOU a little bit, um, you don't really have the same kind of thing you sometimes see in VGC where there's certain leads, common leads you'll go for, or a set of four you'd bring and a set of four, another set of four you'd bring into a different matchup. So really in DOU, teams have to be a little bit more cohesive. And so that's the first thing. Second thing is DOU games are a little bit longer, require more positioning. Uh, there's certain strategies you'll see in DOU that you'll basically never see in a VGC format because things are so fast-paced there. For example, hazards are pretty common in most DOU metagames. This one will, of course, be focused on SV DOU, the current format. But Stealth Rock, Spikes, T-Spikes to an extent. All things you'll see occasionally in DOU metagames, stuff you'll never see in VGC. And so the games being somewhat slower can kind of lend to a little bit more of bulk investment. Uh, it depends on the metagame, of course, but this is stuff I say here does not directly apply to VGC, and stuff you might have gotten from VGC. Well, it's probably mostly applicable. It does not always apply in terms of how you build specific archetypes and whatnot. Um, so yeah, this is the DOU forum. Lots of good threads here. So particularly for team building purposes, if you're a beginner, the things you really want to pay attention to here um, are the viability rankings. This is more of a recommendation for the kinds of things you'd want to use. If you're new to building teams, not every Pokemon fits on the VR. However, there are more Pokemon than this that have a niche, but generally these are the best ones that you want to be using. In DOU, the VR system goes from Tier 1 all the way down to Tier 5 here. And basically, Tier 1 is the best. Generally has less Pokemon. And as you move down the tiers, they typically get larger. And so I guess I'll just do a brief overview here of just what each tier means. Tier 1 is just your best Pokemon, the ones that dominate a format, fit on basically every team. And really the key distinction between Tier 1 and Tier 2, in my eyes, is that Tier 1 is the most splashable Pokemon, the ones that just fit on every team. You kind of just, like it says here, you can't really go wrong by using these Pokemon. They fit on basically every team. And honestly, you could see these on like 40% or more of teams. When Fluttermane was legal in the tier, got banned, thankfully, like a month ago. That thing was, for a while, the sole tier one of the format, or like the top tier one of the format, really consistently on like 60% of teams. So these are really like your meta defining threats. And tier two is still really good. These are like really good Pokemon here. Uh, Deoxys attack should be in tier two. It's not, but if this was like fully updated, it probably would be. Um, but that's a Pokemon, for example, that distinguishes it from tier one. Well, in terms of strength, it might be one of the. It's like the biggest damage dealer in the entire tier right now. It's not tier one because it requires like Psy spam to really effectively use it. So tier two are like your really really strong Pokemon uh, that are like these are like tier two. Oftentimes for me at least is like these are like the bonds you're gonna see a lot of the time. Uh, like they're not on every team, but these are like the top meta threats that you really got to watch out for. You can't really neglect a tier two on in the team builder, or else you'll lose like a significant amount of the time. Um, However, they're not going to be on every team because uh, either like they're not quite as strong, like it says here, as the Mons in tier one. But generally, that just means they're not quite as splashable. You're not going to see them on every team. Yeah. Tier three, this is where we're starting to get more niche. However, these are like fundamentally really solid Pokemon. Uh, However, they're more like specific. They're not quite as splashable as tier two, and generally that's kind of what we're seeing here with this tiered system that DOU has, in terms of viability. Um, like kind of as you go down, the Pokemon you're going to see here fit on less and less teams, or just are weaker. However, I think for the purposes of this video, the more important thing to consider is how often you should be using them, particularly if you are a beginner. Um, Tier one you should be using almost all the time. Tier two, you should be using this on like a sizable chunk of your teams, these Pokemon. Um, and you should probably know how to use all of these different Pokemon. Uh, Tier three, these are Pokemon that like you need to know how to play against it. They're not really niche, but like they're not as quite as splashable. These are kind of like tier three is kind of where the final tier where I would say these Pokemon are good in terms of like the broad general sense. Um, these are Pokemon that like again you really need to know how to play against them. It helps to know how to use them. Um, so yeah, tier four is really when you get into the niche stuff. These are still good mods, but they're really like they're either a little bit too passive, or they don't fit on as many teams, or just they're just not things you should be using all the time. Uh, and here, in the context of DO, you see stuff like the weather setters in particular. Although I think some of these could probably be a little bit higher. These are generally mods that like uh, you can't really. They're pretty niche. All the weather centers in DOU are actually like not that good Pokemon by themselves. They kind of just enable other things, and that's something you can kind of see with some of these mods. Is there are mods that enable other mods, but they're not like really uh, totally. You can't fit them on it like most teams. They're only going to fit on like a specific team style, and even then, they might not even do that job particularly well all the time. And tier five is really like the really niche stuff. That you're not going to see very often, and you don't want to be putting these on too many teams. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of the VR. Like again, I will say, especially as someone gets more experience, you shouldn't really feel yourself too limited to these tiers. Really, like I'm a little bit biased. I use these Pokemon all the time, but these things are kind of more of a recommendation for like people who are newer to team building or just want to know like the things they need to like really know how to play against in a metagame, right? Um, for example, something that might not be on here. Actually, there's quite a fair bit of Pokemon on here right now. Let's look at the team builder I have here. Oh yeah, like Mousehold. You don't really know how to play against Mousehold, right? Um, but you never know. You might load up into a game and you play against someone running Mousehold, and then just OHKOs all the mons in your team with population bump. So that's not something you're going to see very often, but That doesn't mean Pokemon on the VR are not usable. You can make pretty much any Pokemon with like a certain level of stats like usable a little bit. Uh, Something I've done in the past a fair amount. Um, if you know, you know. But like the stuff on the VR is the things you need to take into account primarily when team building. And as I said, particularly the stuff that's in tiers 1 through 3, in my opinion. Um, so yeah, that's kind of a brief overview of the VR. What's all there. We'll take a look at the sample teams briefly here. There's not as much to say about that. Let's see, sample teams here. So these are the sample teams. These are generally like really solid teams. If you're not looking to get into team building yourself, this might not exactly be your video to watch, but um, this is the resource you can find. It gives pretty solid teams. What I'll say about these teams, they're not always like super like innovative. They're just like stuff that demonstrates good styles you can run, and you can make variations on these teams. When I first started playing uh, DOU like a year and a half ago, I had a lot of success with a couple sample teams that I modified a little bit because it kind of fit my playstyle a little bit better. Uh, some of those changes were a little bit questionable, but these are always a good place to start. A good, honestly, something I'd recommend if you're just very new to DOU is just taking a sample team, messing around with it on ladder. If there's something that's not really clicking for you on the team, change a set, change them on, and go from there. That's a good way to learn team building. That's kind of how I did it over time. Uh, just modifying teams, getting an idea of how like teams work together. So these are all the teams you can have here. Here we have like Sky Spam. This is a very interesting team. That's a sample. We have Rain. This team. If you're playing right now, this is definitely a team you want to keep into account. I'm recording this video on March 9th of 2024, but this is a very solid team that if you were playing DOU right now, you should know how to play against Frosty Fan Room. It's really a very well-built team by Fan Game here. And yeah, Size Spam, very offensive team. Again, if Deoxys goes, this won't be a sample anymore. This mod will be banned. And then we have general offense with Nasty Plot Buildingo. So these are kind of an overview of some of the styles we've seen recently. Um, they were updated like half a month ago, so these are relatively current at the moment. So this is one place you can go to get into team building. Just taking some of these teams, um, editing them a little bit, going from there. And they also have past teams. Generally, in DOU's case, this often contain Pokemon that are banned now, such as basically all of these having Fluttermane. Um, but yeah, that's the sample teams thread. Another thread you can look if you want to modify teams is the Team Bazaar. This is really like a little bit of just kind of rolling the dice with some of these teams. Here's where you'll find like team dumps from like tournament players. So some of these teams are going to be a little bit more niche than the stuff you'll find in the sample teams. But really, like, there's a lot of teams here that are very high quality, and you can't really go wrong by using. But it's a bit of a mixed bag. You see some teams here that are like for the funny, for example, just stuff that I've posted in here. Uh, I have a couple team dumps from tournaments, and then I also have just like a team in here that I was just like totally messing around with, like Spiritomb Mousehold. So um, this is kind of what I mean. You can get something that's really, really good, or you can get something that's just a little bit more niche and just for fun. And there's nothing wrong with teams being just for fun, of course. Again, but this is another resource. A lot of players will post in here. It hasn't been as active lately because of Doubles Premier League, but I would anticipate if you're watching this video right now that there will be more posted in here soon. Uh, but yeah, that's the Team Bazaar. You can see Fan Game posting his fan group team, now a sample. So sometimes the teams in here do become samples. Yeah, so that's a brief overview of that. Let me see if there's any more resources in the DOU forum we can go over. There's a metagame discussion thread. This is where, like, talking about Deoxys Mike is probably going to get banned, or probably. The general consensus, I think, is that Deoxys is problematic, but we'll see. Bit of a tangent there. And then if you have questions, you can always ask questions here. I should note, you don't want to make a thread in this forum without permission. That is a rule on Smogon. So if you have questions, you should go here. Yeah, and someone will probably answer it pretty quickly. Uh, So yeah, what else? Oh, other formats, you can find that here as well. This is all focused on DOU or SV DOU, the post I'm making or the video I'm making right now. But if you're interested in other formats, there's resources here. Like every old gen has a VR, every lower tier has a VR, etc. So yeah, that's a brief overview of the resources available. And now we'll get into the main thing here, which is kind of just me like talking about how I build teams in particular and how I would go about building new teams. So we'll open up the team builder here, um, and we'll just start from scratch. Might as well. And as you can see, here's a good resource. Oh, also the Discord, the DOU Discord, and the Showdown Room right here. Good resources as well. So they're all linked in the team builder in case you ever lose access to them. That's a recent change. Very, very glad that we see that. That makes things easier to find. So here, looking at the current DOU tier, this might not be very accurate necessarily a year from now. Maybe through metagame changes, I might make small updates to this video. But yeah, so the process I tend to go with currently, this has changed over time. When making a DOU team, is first you want to like consider the kind of team you're making, obviously. So if we look at the sample teams we had, again, let's see, we had Psi Spam, Rain, Fan Room, just Trick Room in general, Psi Spam again, and Offense. So these are some examples of archetypes that you'd see in DOU at the moment. And really with team building, the best thing to do is you really need to have a goal of what you're doing before you start. When you just start like tossing in monster, like if I go Arcalodon, Farigarath, Excalibur, like that's not going to work, right? I have to know what I'm going for here, and that's kind of just a basic thing, right? But it's important to state. Uh, so for the purposes of this video, I'll start off here, and I'll just talk about. Hmm, we'll just talk about offense. That's an interesting thing to build. And so one of the things that you kind of like encounter while team building is how standard do you make your team, right? The more this is more angled towards people who are maybe newer to building teams. We'll make a more basic team here, but as your like metagame knowledge increases, you can have room for more fringe mons. But for the purposes of this video, we'll try to stick here to Pokemon that kind of are on like the tier 1 through 3, possibly 4 range. Actually, this VR is a little outdated, so there could be things here that maybe don't quite line up with the VR. But of course, metagames are constantly evolving, and new things are being brought. So you can't always look to these resources as like just objective like measurements of like what's good and what's not good. So yeah. So here we'll just take we'll build POW offense. So this is one archetype. Um, and so we're obviously going to use this Pokemon here. And so just as an example for POW, first thing we want to do is we want to think about Pokemon that synergize well with this Pokemon in particular, right? Uh, I'm trying to speak in general terms here. Obviously, I'm building one specific style of team, but this is meant to be generally applicable. Uh, so we have POW. So traditionally, things would pair well with POW. Like this is kind of like the synergy stage. Oh, that's what I'll call it. You're first looking for like just the basic things that fit on your team that for the structure you're trying to make, right? And then from there, that's when you round things out, right? So things that pair well with POW generally priority. This is something we've seen very often in SV. I really like to be paired with like priority stuff, extreme speed from Dragonite or Entei. Uh, and this for this example, we'll just go with Dragonite, right? This is kind of a classic pairing, bid viable. It's basically the start of the gen. Um, and well, actually, we're not going to really fill things out here just yet. But these are two Pokemon that fit well together. And something else we can usually with like the team archetype style. Usually, you'll have like 2 or 3 mons that really fit on that archetype, in my opinion. Obviously, you want your whole team to be like well rounded, but I think something I try to follow at least. So I like to start with like the just the basics of the archetypes, and generally those are going to be 2 to 3 Pokemon. The other thing's going to fit in later and help like round your team out. Um, but here we have Pow and we have Dragonite, and another Pokemon I think generally fits well on these teams is Glamora. This is one that kind of fits well generally uh, in terms of stacking hazards. That's what this Pokemon does. Another, forgot to mention, just a brief thing here. If you are newer to Smogon, one thing that can be helpful is the Smogon decks. You can find the common sets for Pokemon in specific tiers. I'm not sure if there's a way to like look at specific tiers by itself. Let's see. Doubles. Oh, you doubles. Doubles. Okay. So this is like a brief introduction. There's something here as well. General rules. You can find sample sets here for Pokemon you'd want to use. So that's another good resource you can use. Uh, Anyways, that aside, Glamora, very helpful for these PAL offense teams. And that's kind of like our 3 Pokemon here that fit really well together. That's our archetype. Okay, now from here, we have our basic core. And now for DOU specifically, what I kind of try to do from here is I try to like round out the corners of this team, right? I want to be able to position this team at all times. And I try to like, you want to limit the matchups that don't work for you, right? Um, so from this team right now, we can notice we have 2 Pokemon weak to Fairy. We don't want to really add a 3rd Pokemon weak to Fairy. Although we might be able to get away with that in this metagame. But generally, I try to keep like shared weaknesses to 2 or 3, and any more than that is kind of throwing in specific matchups, right? So that's one consideration to make. Kind of just the tight balance of the team. So from here, right, one of the things we really want in a DOU metagame is a fire type, right? I kind of try to fit this on every team that's not rain, um, simply because it's just a really strong type, and the fire types that we have are very strong. So for a long time, when you were choosing a fire type, you were picking between like Chi-Yu, Volcanion, and Heatran. However, the metagame has since shifted, and the 5 mons you'll find in DOU right now are generally like the mons you'd want to use, right? For your fire type slot. Usually Incin, I will say, or Volcanion. Chi-Yu, more offensive teams. Gouging Fire also fits on offensive teams, particularly like this one, right? Where we have more offense, and we can click Howl with Gouging Fire and boost our attack. It's thin. This is the most splashable option. It's a very great positioning tool. If you have any familiarity with doubles or BGC, you already know about Incin. I don't really need to say any more here. Heartflame. You can see this on more offensive teams as well. You can also see it with Follow Me, but I wouldn't consider this one quite on the level of the others. Torkoal, pretty much just for Sun teams. And Volcanion is really great typing in bulk. Fits on bulkier teams that kind of need the type advantage of like the fire water combination, which is really unique and gives you a lot of defensive utility. But here, specifically based on the structure of the team we have so far, I'm going to go with Gouging Fire. Because it pairs really nicely with Pow and D-Knight with the Howl support. And yeah. Okay. So now, generally, another thing I tried to do, this is not something that needs to be followed all the time, but just as a basic guide here, I try to have like a fire, water, grass core. I try to cover all those 3 typings, because if you have those 3 typings, as well as like sometimes you'll see mention of the fairy, dragon, steel core, those 2 like matchup triangles there. If you have that on your team, that really helps your positioning, right? And really just from like a weakness perspective, right? We have 2 Pokemon weak to ground here, with 1 immunity, so that's pretty nice. However, that's what the grass type really helps with, right? It covers that ground weakness, and of course the water weakness for Glamora. So here we're going to want to choose a grass type. This is another thing. For DOU right now, what I would try to do is I would recommend you have a fire type and a grass type. We'll get into why I'm not really including the water type here as much. But for now, we're just going to talk about our grass type we want on this team. Okay, so I'll just give a brief overview of all the options, the common options that we have here. Uh, I guess that's kind of how I want to structure this. Is I'll go over like for each of the things I would consider mandatory on a team, I'll consider your options and the different ways you'd use them. Um, so for your grass type slot, you can use a Mungus. This is pretty good at like exerting spore pressure. Um, it's slower. It's a decent mon. I don't think it's like really fits well in the current metagame. However, it's always like something you should keep in mind. Um, and not a matchup you should ever really neglect because if you don't have any like spore immunities, this Pokemon could really farm you. Well, again, this is just a Sun mon. Ignore this for everything except Sun. Heartflame, we already talked about that. Wellspring is our first like real like goated grass type, right? This one is like pairs with the grass water typing. That's a really excellent type combination. Um, and I think that's what we'll go with here. However, I will explain the other mons here as well. Uh, Wellspring is a redirection mon. Redirection is really important for a lot of teams in DOU because it just gives you another way to like control the game state. You really just shielding your ally from damage with Follow Me is just really invaluable for a lot of teams. And that's what Wellspring does really well. However, it can also be more offensive. Uh, it's a really good mod at checking Lando I, which we'll get into later. Is one of the key players of this metagame currently. And also pretty much the best water type. That's why I don't really recommend slapping a water type on every team, because other than Volcanion and Wellspring, there really aren't any other water types I would consider saying are like really good on a lot of teams. Water types have historically been pretty weak in SV, um, especially with Shifu banned, or Shifu Rapid Strike is banned from DOU. So you can't really run that as an option. Uh, Boom. This is another positional tool, kind of like Ensign. Could put this one on this team as well. Generally, I would say I like Wellspring a little bit more than Rillaboom. Rillaboom is really nice in the current metagame right now. So if you're watching this and Deoxys attack is still legal, this is something to note about Rillaboom. It gives you terrain control, helps with your size spam matchup. Um, Something you really want to keep in mind here. Sinistra, this is for bulkier teams. It's kind of like a heal button. It's like you add the potions item to your team for the cost of one Pokemon slot. This isn't really fitting on our team. It fits more on bulkier teams, really. And that's why it's a little bit lower on the VR. It has two forms, so we're just obviously they do the same thing. And Whimsicott is your grass type for speed control. However, I think this is generally outclassed by Torn, and not really a Pokemon I would say you should be running a lot of time. So anyway, with all that being said, Wellspring pairs really well on this particular team, based on its stats, typing, and whatever. So we'll go with Wellspring here. And finally, this is where we come to a more difficult thing for a lot of teams: is finding the sixth Pokemon. Oftentimes, when I build teams, the first five Pokemon are like really easy to really get a grip on, right? Uh, and the sixth Pokemon can often be a little bit more tricky, right? You have your five. Sometimes the sixth is really easy, but a lot of the times it can be hard to find a Pokemon that covers all the things you're trying to do with the last slot. And so the last slot on a lot of these teams that are centered around like a particular archetype, I would kind of consider it your role compression slot. It kind of like you're trying to fit as much in to round out your team in one slot as you can. And so with this team in particular, what do we notice? We have very offensive stuff. We have our offense basically covered with these two Pokemon. We also have these for general utility. What I'm noticing here is we only have one special attacking Pokemon. Generally, I try to keep that at, I want to have at least two special attacking Pokemon and at least two physical attacking Pokemon in every team. Again, not a hard and fast rule, but it really helps like round your team out into every match that's possible. So that's something we could consider here is adding the special attacker. What else? We have two Pokemon that are generally more support in nature. However, they both can do damage. However, what I'm noticing here, and what's something that every SV team needs right now, is speed control. And this is true of a lot of DOU metagames, but particularly for this metagame where Tailwind is so strong. You really want Tailwind or Trick Room. Anything else is not going to cut it. Uh, and so that's something that this team does not have. It does not have speed control. Um, and so another thing you should keep in mind is, of course, speed control. So we're going to look at Tailwind because this is a faster team, and Trick Room doesn't really fit here. I could probably get away with Farigiraf as a Trick Room option, but we'll get more into Trick Room options later. That's something I'll discuss. Uh, but it's specifically for Tailwind options here. The strongest option is Tornadus. This is a flying type. You've got a new move this generation, Bleak Wind Storm. Extremely strong. It probably fits on the most variety of teams. Uh, fast, strong, can make it deceptively bulky. Um, the other options are Pelipper. This is generally more for rain, and Whimsicott. Uh, this is more for like very offensive teams that appreciate stuff like Encore and Fake Tears that it has that Tornadus doesn't. But on this team, I will say we probably want Torn. Another option I will say, a bit biased here, I've used this Pokemon, one of my favorites. I've used it a lot. Roaring Boom. This is a mon that fits on bulkier teams. Um, it can help with damage mitigation because it has Breaking Swipe, knockoff as well. This is a more bulkier style of team, slower paced. However, with this offensive team we have here, Tornadus is clearly the best option. It's going to help our fast Pokemon outspeed their fast Pokemon. So yeah. Okay, so now we've filled out our team. Um, and that's kind of a brief introduction into like the basic way I'd build a team, right? Um, so we have our Archetype Mons, Chien-Pao, Dragonite, Glamora for damage control. We have our Firewater Grass Core, that's going to help us maneuver. And also, as you know, for DOU, I mentioned that you want your team to be really cohesive, right? That's something I mentioned at the beginning. And these are two Pokemon that fit really well with this archetype. So the trick is balancing the strengths of your team archetype with the general things you want to fit on every team. That's really the art of team building, right? Um, Picking the way to run the team and then the glue lines that are going to help round out that team and make it so you can play it into any possible matchup at least somewhat consistently, right? Um, and so that's what we did here with Gouging Fire and Overpun, and then your speed control slot, slash roll compression. So yeah, I should also mention you can run Mew for Tailwind. That's a minor notice, but that is not something I would recommend a lot of the time. But generally, Torn is going to be your speed control mod for these offensive teams. And so that's a brief overview. Before we do anything else, I'll just go through the process of filling out sets on this team. And then we'll get into other things you need to consider for a lot of teams, different archetypes you can run as well. Okay. So we have our team here. And with POW, one thing you can do is you can always just fill out the sample sets that they have here. They have a Life Orb set or a Sash set. And that's certainly something you can do. You can go into import, export, and click on the things at the bottom, sample sets. That certainly works a little bit. However, I will just go through the process of doing this manually because I think it's valuable to learn. And note that that option's available to you, but the point of this video is to instruct. So, with POW, generally I consider the best set to be Sash Adamant at the moment. However, this has changed over time. In the past, Life Orb is really strong, and we could run Life Orb here. However, this team does concern me a little bit with its frailty, so we will run Sash. And then we'll run. With this team, we don't really have too much for terrain control, so I will go Ice Spinner. You can run this one. You always want an Ice move, great offensive type, obviously. So the options are Ice Spinner or Icicle Crash. This team doesn't really have much of a Side Spin matchup, so I'll go with Ice Spinner to remove the terrain. And then generally run Sucker Punch, Sacred Sword, and Protect. And then I generally like Terastallization. We'll have a Terastallization section later. But that's kind of what I would run on this Swan in particular. So we'll just briefly fill it out. Again, we'll have an EV section later, but I will make this adamant. And then Dragonite, Standard Choice Band, Extreme Speed, Stomping Tantrum. I kind of think Aerial Ace is really nice as like a flying move. It hits a lot of mons. And then probably... This one has a lot of moves. It's kind of hard to choose sometimes. But I will run, let's see. This team could struggle a little bit with Diancie, so I'm going to run Ironhead here because that could be really clutch if we queue into that Pokemon. And then Tera Normal for this guy always. Uh, EVs generally max attack on this Pokemon, and I'll creep it a little bit here. I'll explain why later. And then you jump in bulk because you don't really need the speed. You're clicking extreme speed a lot of the time. All right, Glamora. So this team, there's two ways we can run Glamora, but for this team, I mentioned I wanted it specifically for the hazards. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to add Sash. This is going to give us, along with POW, 2 Sash Mons. Something I forgot to mention earlier. DOU does not have item clause, unlike BGC. You can run as many items of the same kind as you want. Generally, you're still going to want variety of items, but like here, with this team could be a little bit frail. We can make some of the Mons bulkier later, but I think 2 Sash Mons is pretty appropriate here. And so we're going to click Stealth Rock. This is going to help these Pokemon later in the game hit harder, pick up more KOs with Pokemon taking chip every time they switch in. And then we're gonna run Mortal Spin. This is gonna give us Hazard Control. Other options here include Earth Power. You can probably read up a little bit on this in the Smog decks. Different options for this mon. You sometimes see like Power or Meteor Beam, but for this team we're running Hazard Stacking, so I will run Mortal Spin. Power Gem. Rock type has historically been very, very good into DOU metagames. So something to keep in mind here. I'm noticing this team in particular has 4 rock weeks. I said earlier I try not to have more than 3 of the same weakness, but for POW teams it's a little bit unavoidable. And rock type isn't that common, so that was what makes this one really good. It hits a lot of things with the rock typing. And yeah, so this is just a basic team. Stacking 4 rock weeks is a little bit careless, but I think this is probably the best way you can build this out anyway, so not too concerned. We have ways to damage it between Wellspring, Dragonite. This is often Terrain anyway, and POW. Okay. We'll make it Terra Grass. Again, we'll get into that later. So, Gouging Fire. Generally, this one runs booster energy on this team. We're going to be clicking Howl a lot. Burning Bulwark, very broken protect move. Breaking Swipe, give us a little bit of damage control. We don't have Intimidate, but with Gouging Fire, you often don't need that because you're clicking Breaking Swipe a lot. And then Heat Crash hits things pretty hard. And we want speed booster energy, so that's what we're going to do with the EVs here. I'll get into this more later. Let's see, and then we'll jump at both. Tera, I like Fairy. Alright, Wellspring, more offensive team. So I want it to be more offensive. It's going to outspeed Landoi, remove Landoi for us. Follow Me, just for, again, very strong move. And Woodhammer. I've liked Woodhammer recently. You could run Hornbleach as well. I think that's slightly more common. And get into EVs later, but I'll just max out the HP here. It's something that's pretty good for this one. And then Torn. Torn is typically a few items. You could run Bulky Cloak. You could run Fast Sash. I said I'm liking a lot recently. It's Cloak with Tailwind, Liquid Storm, Taunt, and Protect. And then we make it pretty bulky. Again, EVs later, but this is just a basic example of how to fill out a team. Hopefully that's helpful. We'll get the paste here in case anyone wants to run this. Pretty basic team, but I think it's pretty viable. You can click Howl next to Wellspring, POW, and even sometimes Dragonite here, and that's going to really be your offense. A little more to stack hazards and Torn for speed control. Pretty basic team, and that's how I just go about building the team style. So yeah. Now, what I would like to do is I'd like to go into mons you need to really take into account in this meta currently, and how you generally account for the team builder. So, first off, we're going to look at the viability rankings here. So, as you can see, we want to take into account for Wellspring. Things that are going to help with that, obviously. This isn't a Pokemon that's going to really be too scary as long as your team's well-rounded. It's just generally a really good supporting option. So not really too much we need to do here. Archaludon, this is the first big threat here that I'd say is something you really need to make sure your team breaks. That's not something every team can do. The good teams can, right? But This is something you actually have to think about as opposed to Wellspring, where your team could probably handle it anyway. Um, but Arcaludon, if you have the wrong team, could really be dangerous. So for Arcaludon, something that really helps is Landorus Incarnate. Um, Lando I here. One of the dominant wall breakers in the tier. Didn't have it on the last team, but this Pokemon is really solid. Special attacker for breaking through Arcaludon. Uh, and so, generally, with the Pokemon you want to look out for, you want to look at their weaknesses. Generally, if this was tournament prep, what I would do is I would look at someone's replays. We'll just take my friend Keanu here as an example. If I was prepping for Keanu in a tournament, I'd look at the stuff he's running. This kind of fits into the accounting section here. You look at the stuff the opponent's running, and then things that just match up well onto them. Kind of just from the type chart, just basic stuff for the most part. Look at what that Pokemon does and how you could hinder that. But for Arcaludon, the trouble's often knocking it out. It's that's where Landorus Incarnate comes in here as your way to like primarily break it for most teams. Yeah. So moving on here, Incineroar, again, kind of like Wellspring. Generally, these are positional tools. You're not going to have too much trouble damaging them. These are Pokemon you kind of need to outplay in the game. However, you do want to make sure that you're not bringing 6 physical attackers, so Infant just clicks, or switches in, clicks Intimidate, or not clicks Intimidate, activates Intimidate, clicks Parting Shot, and makes your life miserable. So that's what you want to do with Instant. Glamora helps out special attackers. These 4 Mons all lose to Landorus Incarnate. Seems like this Pokemon should be tier 2, hint hint. But again, Glamora with the hazards. This is one of the primary reasons you want to have special attackers on every team. So you can damage this thing without setting up toxic spikes. But that's kind of just something you need to keep in mind. Again, Lando I gonna help here a lot. Deals with both Glamora and its most common Tera, which is Grass, Spike Looking Sludge Bomb. Just a brief overview of how you use this one anyway. Life Orb, Earth Power, Sludge Bomb, Substitute, Protect. And so this is going to help you against a lot of these mons. Particularly into certain scouts, this Pokemon might look really good. And that's something I'd recommend to do a lot of these Pokemon. Matches up pretty well here. Kingambit, something you'd want to make sure you know how to damage. Was just talking with Penter the other day about this one. Lando I matches up well, but this is a Pokemon you might have to dedicate. If you want to make sure you have multiple ways to damage it, because this can be really threatening. Kind of like Arcaludon. Can be a little bit hard to damage in certain scenarios, so another mon to keep in mind. Rillaboom, again, another positional tool. Generally, the positional tools you're not going to have trouble dealing with. As long as your team's like well built, you have to outplay those in the game. The stuff we're talking about here is the offensive or things that your team isn't going to automatically be able to deal with. That might match up well into teams that you naturally build. So Rillaboom, again, kind of a utility option. You're not really like too concerned about like specifically countering that, and Torn as well. But it's the Glamora, Kingambit, and the Arcaludon here that could really mess with you as long as if you don't properly account for them both offensively and defensively in your team builder. And for all these Pokemon, it's kind of funny that Lando I is what I would recommend, but other stuff, special attackers for Arcaludon, special attackers for Glamora, and just fighting type coverage. Like we had Pow on that team to click Sacred Sword, ground type moves. Generally just stuff that answers the weaknesses. Seems pretty basic, but that's just something you want to do. And we could repeat this process with Tier 3. Amoonguss, have a grass type so you don't get spored, or run safety goggles if you don't. Baxcalibur, physical mitigation. Pow, physical mitigation. Chi-Yu, have fire resists. Deoxys, run dark types, or run Rillaboom, or Fort to ban it tomorrow. That's probably the most viable option. This Pokemon's broken. Get it out of the tier. Diancie, this is another big one. Diancie, Lando I can deal with it, but you're going to want multiple ways to deal with this on most teams. For our team, that's why we put Ironhead on Dragonite, just a way to deal with it. So this is just another Pokemon you want to make sure you have a way to damage. And that's really what it is with a lot of these mons. Making sure you can knock them out, and they're not going to just run away with the game for you, right? Entei, not a Pokemon I'd be too concerned, but just having ways to deal with fire types offensively. You should already be able to damage this since you're you want to make sure your team can damage Incineroar a little bit. Dango, et cetera, on and on and on. So look at the Pokemon in these first three tiers in particular. Make sure you have a game plan into all of them. And we could do that with this team. I'm not going to really bore you with doing that, but the first three tiers is what I'd really recommend, making sure you have outs into every mon. There might be one where the matchup's a little bit dicier, and that's natural. That's something I want to emphasize here. Not all there's no team that matches up perfectly into everything. There's always going to be at least one matchup that isn't always easy to play, and that's okay. That's natural. And that's really, in my opinion, what distinguishes, like, in terms of like actually playing, people that are good at piloting teams versus people that are great players that are excellent at piloting a variety of teams. It's really being able to pilot those matchups that aren't in your favor. But just for team building in particular, you can't account for everything, but you want to make sure you can at least play the matchup, and then you don't just auto lose on preview for any of these Pokemon in Tier 1 for free. In Tier 4, I wouldn't really worry about that too much. These are rare, so it's not as hard to account, and generally these Pokemon aren't like to the point where they'd outright beat you anyway. So yeah, that's kind of like how you'd account for certain threats. So yeah. So moving on, um, I think I'd like to talk a little bit about Terastallization and the Tera types you're running on a lot of these Pokemon. Um, Generally in doubles, the secret uh, is salvaging as many matchups as possible. In singles, the difference is you often see offensive Teras that make Pokemon really broken, such as Tera Ice Regieleki, so it can gain coverage. Gaining coverage with Tera, as you'll see here with Tera Blast, is not really something that's like super common in DOU, and that's not how I would recommend you use Tera on most of your Pokemon. Generally, what you want to use Tera for is so your Pokemon can escape bad defensive matchups. Pokemon that are going to get OHKO'd by moves, and you want to make it show that they can't. And really, the best Teras in DOU are the ones that can both serve some offensive function uh, and the defensive trait. But really, I consider the defensive utility of having your Tera available as the most important thing. So I'm not going to click Tera Ground with my Landau and then still get bonked by Ivy Cudgel from Wellspring and just die. So that's why in this Pokemon I run Poison. This is a great example of combining defensive utility, Poison type, a really great defensive type, helps with like things like Rillaboom, but it also helps offensively because you often run Sludge Bomb, boosted by Sheer Force and Life Orb, of course, and that's going to help you deal more damage. So really what you want to do with Tera is cover your weaknesses. Landau doesn't quite do that. It doesn't like resist its weaknesses with this Tera. I've also seen Water, and this is pretty solid because you resist Water and Ice. This is good as well. But generally Poison for this one, or Water. That's really what you want to do. You want to cover the bad matchups. And so we'll do a few more examples of this. As well as we'll cover a few Pokemon where you can get away with the offensive Tera. Flutter in the past was something you could click Tera Fairy on, and that was the best Tera. You used the Tera offensively. And generally the mons that use Tera offensively in doublers are the ones I would argue are a little bit broken. Urshifu clicking Tera Water Surging Strikes, the other Urshifu clicking Tera Dark Wicked Blow, Fluttermane clicking Tera Fairy Dazzling Gleam, Deoxys clicking Tera Psychic Expanded Force. However, there are a few instances, such as Landau, where it does help you a little bit offensively. So yeah, so for fire types, generally what I want to do here is I want to click the Grass Tera. That covers all the weaknesses most of the time. You can also run Tera Dragon or Tera Water. However, I would recommend Tera Grass, particularly on Incin, Chiyu. Gouging Fire a little bit less so because it already has the Dragon type. Volcanion, click Tera Grass. So for Fire type, the common Teras you want to be running are Grass and Dragon and Water. Those three, I wouldn't argue for anything else really under most circumstances. Except for Torkoal or Heartflame. Well, your mandatory Tera on Heartflame is Fire, but for Torkoal, you're clicking Trick Ribbon, you're clicking Specs Eruption, and Terra Fire is fine on that. But generally, for your TU, your Ensign, and your Volcanion, uh, and to a lesser extent, Gouging Fire, Terra Grass also covers your Amogus matchup. You can Terra into a Spore Immunity. Um, and so that's how I'd Terra defensively for most fire types, as well as Dragon. Uh, Steel types, speaking of Terra Dragon, I consider Terra Dragon on Goldango and Kingambit. A little bit less so Kingambit, but especially Goldango. Very strong Terra in that it resists all the elemental types. So if your Pokemon is weak to like both water and grass, you can consider the water, or no, not the water, the grass Terra or the Dragon Terra. Um, Goldango, very excellent user of Terra Dragon. A lot of these mons are weak to steel, so generally the Terra you'll see is usually fairy. You'll see that with Archaludon. Or you can also run Flying. Flying's also solid. It covers both fighting and ground coverage. I've also seen Terra Bug in the past, but that's generally a meme pick. Don't run that if you're a beginner, please. It's not that good. Whatever Shister tells you, it's not that good. Don't run Terra Bug Roaring Moon. It's not that guy. So generally, Flying or Fairy for most of your steel types. You can also run that for Goldango as well, albeit for different reasons. 'Cause it's a ghost type. Ghost types generally pair pretty well with Terra Fairy. But generally, Terra Fairy or Terra Flying for these mods. It covers a lot of weaknesses. Alright. Grass types, biggest issue, often fire. That's why I would approve of Terra Fire, or Terra Water, or Terra Dragon on most of these Pokemon. Uh, Offensive Pokemon, stuff like Whimsicott, stuff like Chi-Yu, a little bit, stuff like Shenpao. Feral Pokemon that don't want to have fake out moves against them can run Terra Ghost. And that's generally the only use case I'd advise for Terra Ghost. I don't think it's that good of a Terra, except for cheesing the fake out dodge. And it's very powerful because it forces a 50-50 in a lot of situations. Oftentimes a weighted 50-50 in your favor, because calling a Terra type is not easy. And a lot of the time, right? Um, so stuff like Whimsicott, stuff like Torn, stuff like Chi-Yu, and stuff like Shenpao. Or stuff I'd advise Terra Ghost on. You can dodge fake out. Okay. What other types should we cover here? Stuff weak to ground, usually Terra Grass. That should cover it. Generally, the best Terra types are, I'd say, Dragon, Grass, Fairy, Ghost. Those are the ones you're using a lot of the time. But that's the kind of process you use. You identify the weaknesses for the Pokemon. Often for Dragon types, I should add, there's a lot of Dragon types, so this is worthwhile. You can run Terra Fairy on these, Gouging Fire, Archaludon, Raging Bolt, and then that really helps into your matchups with the other dragons. So, yeah, those are generally the Terras I'd recommend using. And that's kind of the process I would use to decide your Terras. Just go over the weaknesses of the Pokemon. What matchups do you want it to be able to win against, or like play at least a little bit better into? For example, like if you run into rain, Chi-Yu is usually dead weight, right? However, with Terra Grass or Terra Dragon or whatever to resist water, Chi-Yu all of a sudden could be pretty threatening to these rain teams because it doesn't just get OHKO'd. And so that's kind of like what you want to do with your Terras. Helps to consider just broader archetypes in general it might help with, but generally you can't really go wrong with looking at the individual matchups for the Pokemon and choosing like a type that reflects the weaknesses, covers the weaknesses. It'll help you. Okay, so that's mostly how I deal with Terra. Really just look at the weaknesses for the Mon, identify what you want to Terra out of. If there's like a really powerful centralizing threat, that can often change things. For example, Terra Fire when Fluttermane was legal was very good. Can also run stuff like Terra Steel or Terra Dark now with Dio running around. So if there's something broken that you're really afraid your team loses to, run a Terra that resists that, and that can really be a way you can try to play around the matchup. And I would argue that's part of why Fluttermane was able to stay in the tier so long was you could adapt with your Terras. So despite it abusing Terra offensively, you could Terra Pokemon that were weak to it, and that was often a weakness it had. It couldn't really always deal with mods that tear it. Okay, so now I'd like to take a brief look at EVing. I'm not, I will say, the greatest person at like EVing Pokemon. However, I think I've picked up a decent amount of skill at this. I create pretty decent EV spreads a lot of the time. I think, I hope. Um, this is kind of something that really helps to like learn over time. Uh, Experience is the best guide to making EV spreads. Knowing like the threats in the metagame that are going to be hard to deal with, the things you need to speed creep. But how I would usually deal with EV spreads, the process I use is as follows. Uh, I start with the speed stat. I always start with the speed stat. It doesn't matter what the Pokemon is. I always start with the speed stat. And the reason being is with Tailwind being so common in this format and being mandatory on most teams, that's really something that I think you need to like consider first is your speed control. I don't. SV is the format that I have the most experience with, as well as NatDex. So I have most experience with NatDex or no SV formats, and really in all of these formats, Tailwind and speed control is most necessary. So that's why I always start with the speed stat. I can't really speak as to if that's like what you'd start with in other gens. However, I don't think you can really go wrong by starting with speed in any format. It's the most important stat. That and HP. Every other stat is fake. These two stats are the most important stats. All the others, whatever. But these two, most invaluable. So, with this, I try to pick a benchmark, right? Uh, there's a lot of different ways you can do it, and it depends on the team and the Pokemon. So, for example, if I'm concerned about Glamora with this Pokemon, like really concerned about Glamora, I'm going to creep this thing to 299. 1 point faster than Glamora. I can always outspeed it. I can always do damage. And that's going to win me the interaction a lot of the time, right? Uh, However, with Tailwind support, uh, uh, other speed benchmarks I've liked in the past, 232. This Pokemon doesn't need to hit that benchmark. It already hits it naturally. But that's going to outspeed Scarfland OT. Not a huge threat in the metagame anymore. However, I do consider that a pretty solid benchmark, especially for slower Pokemon. Uh, that'll outspeed a lot of things. It'll outspeed no investment base 85s like Rillaboom, which is often 206. That'll outspeed no speed land OT, etc. So that's a speed benchmark I kind of like is 232. For formats where there's like a lot of Scarf base 100s, 247 is kind of nice. It can outspeed Scarf Chi-Yu under Tailwind. Again, not as much of a meta threat anymore. Other speed benchmarks you can consider with Pokemon. 271, this outspeeds stuff like Chenpao or Fluttermane when it was legal under Tailwind. Not under Tailwind, with like a speed drop, right? So if you click Icy Wind on like a Fluttermane, with 271 you'll outspeed that, and you can outspeed it after that. So that's the speed benchmarks. In this particular metagame, with Deoxys legal, again, might not be true in the future if you're watching this video. I sure hope it's not true, but it can creep down to 220, and what that's going to do is that's going to outspeed Deoxys attack under Tailwind. Very important benchmark in this current metagame. If you have a slower Pokemon, a Pokemon you're not thinking about investing as much in speed, for example, Goldango, oftentimes I don't think you want to run. I think you get a lot more out of bulk on this Pokemon. Generally set up Pokemon, invest in the bulk. That's my advice. So stuff like Chi-Yu, I think the Nasty Plot set is far and away the best bet. I'm a bit biased in this regard. However, my experience over time has taught me that this Pokemon, the bulkier you make it, the more threatening it is. Because this is a Pokemon that has deceptively high bulk. It has low HP. This is a tangent. But anyways, for some mid-tier stuff like this, like Goldango, where often I'm investing in bulk because I'm clicking Nasty Plot. This is the best Goldango set. Fight me. This is going to outspeed Deoxys attack under Tailwind. That's really going to help you into Size Spam. Like, that is so critical into the Deoxys matchup that this is fundamentally right now the best speed benchmark in the game. in my opinion, if you're not fully investing. Again, the basic thing you can always do is you can always go max max, especially if you're newer with more offensive Pokemon. This is you can run this right. You can run specs. Um, so for more offensive sets, you can definitely get away with more basic spreads. 252, 252. A little bit overhated sometimes by some people, I think. But if it gets the job done, it gets the job done. And many people would point out to me that I often forget the last four EVs. It might matter. You never know. Games can be decided by the most minute of margins, so always make sure you include that last EV. You never know when that might make you live on 1 HP. Um, so yeah, generally how I like to approach a lot of these buildings. I like to get as much bulk out of these Pokemon as I can. That's kind of a personal preference thing. And that's why, right, I'm like maxing out this HP and I'm doing blah 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 blah. Uh, this EV section is going to be pretty long. Might be the most insightful part of the video into my building process, but yeah. So from here, what I'd like to do, right, is other things you could consider within EV. So Pokemon with a low HP stat like you, if I'm making this bulky, I always want to invest in that first. HP is the other critical stat, in my opinion. For the attack stats, of course, you want your Pokemon doing damage in this format, but often with the way how things are offensive, like in this format in particular, I think investing in bulk a lot of the time is really helpful, right? Uh, and so, yeah, that's one thing to keep in mind with EVing is clicking uh, max HP on Pokemon with low HP. You get so much value because that's how EVs work, right? The less your stat is, the more marginal gain you get from investing in that stat. Uh, for example, Kartana is not even in this game, right? But investing in this SPDEF stat, investing max EVs, you practically double its SPDEF, right? So that's just an example. Like the lower the stat is, the more you get out of investing in it, particularly with bulk. All right. That covers the HP stat, kind of. Pokemon with high HP stats, it's often more optimal to invest in SPDEF or the defensive first. Um, so that's something you can do. Um, however, uh, there's calculators you can find online that will do these calculations for you and tell you what the most optimal ways to invest are. So I'll just find that. Let's see. Here's one I've used for a long time. Pokemon EV Optimizer. And I often take advantage of this resource. You can put in a Pokemon. This is only up for like Gen 6, I think. Or actually, it's even older than that. Uh, so often you have to put in custom. Um, and then you fill in the stats, blah, blah, blah. The nature that you're using. We'll get into natures in a sec. Don't worry. And then this will balance out the bulk, right, on both sides. That's something I like to do, right? Uh, I like to make my Pokemon have balanced bulk, or at least as close as you can get. Particularly with stuff like Wellspring. Like in the past, I've run a lot of bulky Wellspring, and what I've tried to do is I've tried to make these Pokemon have like pretty even like defense and SPDEF. Because I think, particularly with redirectors, that's pretty nice. But again, not something you have to do. This is only for bulky Pokemon. But if you ever want to get the most optimal bulk out of whatever remaining UV spreads you have, go to a EV optimizer. You can also run this thing. This is a more up-to-date site with the modern Pokemon. Does the same thing. So yeah, that's something I'd advise you to do if you're ever trying to get maximum bulk value, is visit one of these websites. Yeah. Okay. So, attack sets. What you want to do with these, particularly if it's a more offensive one, what I like to do, this is my personal preference. This whole video, obviously, is based on like what things I like to do when I'm building teams, right? But what I like to do with like EV attack and special attack stances, the only thing I'm really too worried about a lot of the time is making sure I pick up the KOs I think I should be able to pick up, right? Uh, So in the past, I've done silly things like hitting like round numbers, like with Chiyu in the past. I'd hit like 350 because I'm like, oh, that's pretty good, and then I'd like drop it, right? But I wouldn't really advise that. But basically, you go into the calculator, and basically you kind of just want to make sure that the KOs you think you should be picking up, such as if I'm using Lando I should be KOing Incineroar most of the time, right? So if I'm running Landorus Incarnate, the most common instant spread. See, this is gonna the most you can't really drop below 252 special attack on this Pokemon most of the time, unless you're running like Nasty Plot, right? Because if you do any less, it's already a roll, but at least it's in your favor, right? If you go any less, um, you're not going to be KOing this Pokemon a lot of the time, and that's pretty bad. So avoid the embarrassing. Oh, it lived on 1 HP. Always make sure if you can get there without like dropping your speed. Like Landau as a bond, you really need to have this speed stat. It gets so much value out of this base 101. Again, common speed tiers you want to keep in mind: base 100, base 110, or base 111 for Torn. So for a lot of faster Pokemon, what you could do, let's see, you could creep like to the 354 stat. Damn, there's like no fast Pokemon, but like if I was running like no speed Shed Pow, I'd creep to 354 because that outspeeds Torn. So speed benchmarks you want to keep in mind: Torn 354, that'll always outspeed it. Um, base 100, always viable for a lot of bonds, like Landau. It gets to 101, outspeeds that base 101 benchmark. The other benchmark, which is really nice for Pokemon like Ogerpon Wellspring, is Creeping Lando I. So that's the other speed tier that's really nice to creep. Glamora as well. So it kind of just depends on what's good in the format. So right now, again, like I said, Deoxys Attack, Tornadus, Lando I, Glamora. Um, and when you get down to slower things, what I like to do sometimes is just like add a little bit of EVs, maybe outspeed like an opposing Rillaboom or something. Stuff like that helps. So yeah, speed benchmarks always important to know. Um, and so yeah, but anyways, that's a tangent. So Pokemon, some Pokemon are kind of locked into specific EV spreads because that's what it does in the metagame, and it fulfills its job. And so with Lando I, run 252, 252. That's my advice. And again, you can often get pretty good EV spreads from the Smogon deck. That'll provide you resources or the sample sets here. Um, but if you're EVing, I'm just going through like my process here of like the things I'd keep in mind. And so yeah, the thing you want to do with attack stats, if you're following what I'd like to do, is avoid embarrassing calcs that you don't pick up the KO on. But the thing is, in SV, I've often found that like the defensive calcs are more important than the offensive ones because a lot of the offensive calcs are set in stone no matter what. So, for example, if I'm clicking Earth Power into Goldango, obviously this isn't the greatest example because, like I said, you want to run max special attack anyway. But even if you have like the bulkiest possible Goldango here, it's still going to pick up the KO. So this kind of gets at the point I'm trying to make here is you can often afford to drop attack stats as long as you're picking up the KOs that the Pokemon should be picking up. Um, and so that's why I generally invest in bulk more because I think it's more applicable to a variety of situations. And it really just you get so much value out of investing in your HP stats and your defense stat as well, defense, special defense, whatever. Um, so yeah, that's what I like to keep in mind. Now we'll get into the nature. So a mistake I often made when I was newer to EVing was I'd use unoptimal EV spreads. Now often this doesn't like totally matter as much, right? Uh, but what you want to do is make sure the positive nature is going on the stat with the high that has the highest value, numerical value, right? So if I want my Pokemon, what's a good example I can use for this? We'll use Wellspring in its bulk because it's pretty good. Uh, if I want my wellspring to be very defensive, right? Blah 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 blah. Uh, and I put my nature here, or I'm gonna go into the midground, right? So if I want 266 defense and 56 special defense, or actually no, that's wrong. If I want 266 special defense and 236 defense, right? This EV spread is not optimal. I need to put this plus number here. We'll just dump the rest of the stats elsewhere to illustrate a point, which we'll see in a sec. Uh, if I want these specific stats, the better thing to do is put the plus nature on the SPDEF. I can creep it down to 266, and because of the way that natures work, they multiply by 10%. You get more value out of this, and thus, I just got 3 extra defense points out of putting the nature on the right stat, right? Uh, and so that's something to keep in mind. Make sure your EV spreads are optimal. Uh, you want to make sure that you're getting as much value out of your EVs as possible because you only have 512 of them, and they don't grow on trees. So, yeah, make sure that your EV spreads are getting as much value as they possibly can, and that's the biggest thing to keep in mind with the nature. I don't really have too much to say. There are some edge cases to this rule. For example, if the stats are like within one of each other or whatever, often this doesn't like quite matter. You don't need to worry about it. But it's a generally good practice to like do here is put the stat on the right one. And often with speed, that's when it can get complicated because oftentimes for certain speed benchmarks you need a positive nature anyway, and so you're kind of locked into that nature. Um, but for the bulkier spreads that I often use myself, you always want to make sure you're getting using the right nature for the stats you want. So figure out the stats first, and then figure out the nature. That's generally my advice, right? Because that'll make sure you get the nature right every time. Okay, let's see. Anything else I'm forgetting here in regards to EV? I covered attack. I covered speed. I covered HP. Yeah, I think that's generally the general gist of what you want to do with EVing. Uh, yeah, hopefully that's helpful. Uh, Let me know if I forgot anything. I can try to like provide some like answer in the comment section or on Discord or whatever. Uh, yeah. So now we'll get into more specific metagame stuff here. Um, the things I want to make sure I'm including on every team, like a checklist basically for what you want on your teams. Um, this video is a little bit all over the place. I'll have chapters. You can watch whatever you're interested in watching, right? But the checklist for things I want to make sure I'm including on every team. I got into this a little bit earlier when I was building that team out. I want to make sure I have a fire type. I went over that. I want to make sure I have a grass type. Helps to do a lot of matchups. Let's see. Yeah, that's her grass type. Um, Whatever. But other things you want to make sure. Speed control. Talked about that. I want to make sure I have tailwind on every team that's not trick room. Run tailwind on every team that's not trick room. Run tailwind on every team that's not trick room. That's what you want to do. Um, Other things you want to keep in mind, just generally. Uh, you want to make sure your team doesn't have any more than 3 weaknesses. Uh, that's a rule I like to follow. Didn't quite follow it earlier. Bad advice. Just kidding. But with some types, you can kind of drop it a little bit. But with like really strong rock types of types, you want to make sure you're like not too weak to it. There's a famous meme in DOU about ground resists. Um, and it illustrates a good point. You don't want to have too many shared weaknesses across your team structure, or else you might get owned. So yeah. What else here? Oh yeah, just like attacking balance. Talked about this a little bit earlier, but make sure you have at least 2 attackers and 2 special attackers on every team, in my opinion, because that makes sure like if someone's running like a higher defense body press mon, if you have a special attacker, you can break that most of the time. Uh, and with if someone's running like a really strong special wall or like some kind of mon that clicks comm mine, you want to make sure you can break that as well. So that's why you want to have a balance of both attacking styles, right? Okay, and you always want to make sure you have like kind of one positional tool or damage mitigation, right? So what makes Incineroar so good is that it combines those two, the damage mitigation with the parting shot positioning to make sure you have switch-ins, uh, repositioning on the board, right? So that's like pivot moves, right? Parting shot, U-turn, volt switch, flip turn, right? And so usually it's kind of nice to have at least one of these on a team. One of my friends, Shister, he always tells me he wants to make sure the team builder that he has more of these, or at least one of these, right? And that's something I generally agree with. Repositioning is so valuable in competitive Pokemon, whether you're playing singles or doubles. Less so in BGC because things are so fast paced, but even then, these moves are very good, right? And so in a metagame like DOU, you always want to make sure you have probably one pivot move on a team. Um, Again, it's not like always hard and fast, right? Like on this team, we didn't really have that, but that's because this team is so offensive. It's not really switching out most of the time anyway. Um, but for your bulkier teams where you need position, make sure you have that. And usually, you want to have Intimidate or some kind of damage mitigation. Snarl, see that sometimes. It's not something to keep in mind. Like we fulfilled this role before with like Breaking Swipe on Gouging Fire. Other things you can use for this are like you can run Snarl, Raging Bolt. You can run Breaking Swipe, Growing Moon. Yeah, so that's like you want to have at least one way to do that. Handle the damage mitigation. One way to handle the positioning. Uh, and another positional tool, of course, is Fake Out. I try to conclude this on most teams that are not super offensive, like the one we had. So I didn't have Fake Out on that team, but it's solid to have one of Instant or Rillaboom on most of your teams. Again, right now, both these Pokemon, but particularly Rillaboom, very strong because it helps your size span matchup, right? Um, so that's what Fake Out does. Fake Out and repositioning moves like Parting Shot and U-Turn. Very good. That's what makes Incineroar Rillaboom. They have Fake Out, both, and then they have Parting Shot or U-Turn, and that's what makes these Pokemon so valuable, and that's why they fit on so many teams, right? So that's something requirements to have. Keep in mind. A uh, redirection, or no, oh, another thing, redirection. I'm I'm I misspoke, but that's something that you should also keep in mind. It's not something you'll usually use Wellspring or Indeedee. You don't want this on every team, but it's an item you might want to check. A good resource for this, it hasn't been updated in a while. The Role Compendium. Um, and this is something you can generally keep track of. It's a little bit separate from what I'm talking about, but this is Pokemon that fulfill specific roles. So like you'll see like common moves like Fake Out and Taunt, Redirection. Um, yeah, so this is a good resource. Uh, Hopefully it'll get updated at some point. But yeah, this is a good resource you can use. But these are even if the mods themselves aren't updated, you can always like filter by in the team builder by these moves or abilities or whatnot. So yeah, something to keep in mind there. Um, hmm. Yeah, follow me. Not on every team, but we'll help you. Good positional tool. Okay, type balance. Usually, fire, water, grass core is the one I generally specify. Again, water types more limited. Can't always fulfill this, but something to keep in mind. Uh, let's see. Looking by my teams, what do I make sure I always include? Yep, damage mitigator. Uh, Follow me, redirection, speed control, tailwind, intimidate, fake out, positioning. And then also, like, you always want to make sure you have some Pokemon that can deal damage. Some, like, your win conditions. This is kind of like something I should have stated earlier, right? But, a way to win the game, right? Your offensive ones, that's something that team we built earlier is, not exactly lacking. It just does damage until all his opponent's Pokemon faint, right? Um, but Pokemon like Senatmons, Nasty Plot Goldango, that's a win condition. Lando Eye, it's a good wall breaker. So offensive ones. You usually want at least two of these on your team. Two or three is the sweet spot, I'd say. Uh, any less, you might struggle to break through like bulkier teams, right? Um, and so sometimes it's nice to have one physical and one special wall breaker. Not super like necessary, but always make sure you have ways to deal damage. Stall is not viable in DOU. Uh, the closest way you'll get to stall is clicking nasty plot on Gold Dingo with a team with Wo-Chien and Tinglu. I've done that before. Don't ask. Uh, but that's something you want to keep in mind. Is have your win conditions. Another thing you want to make sure you have in your team. Okay. In terms of things you might more specifically want on a team, some teams really benefit from having a way to stop fake out. Um, and so that's like uh, Trigger or DD, those abilities, whatnot. Uh, I guess I'll go over items in a bit. That's something to consider as well. But yeah, then also damage mitigation. Another thing that falls into that is like screens. I'm not really much of a screens fan myself, despite using bulkier teams, because I think you can get more value out of investing in your EVs, right, than you can out of like light screen and reflect. However, particularly with the snow archetype, Aurora Veil is quite strong, and this is the best screen saver I'd say is Ninetales Soul. Uh, yeah, let's see what else here. A little bit loose. Hmm. I guess I can go into more specific team structures here. In terms of what they'd require. So if you're running Trick Room, forget what I said about Tailwind, right? You want your Trick Room mods, and usually want at least two of these. Maybe one if you're running Semi Room, but two is kind of the sweet spot, in my opinion. DNC is probably the best Pokemon at setting Trick Room all the time, if I'd had to guess. P2 does a good job as that as well. So your Trick Room mods, generally DNC, Farigiraf, or P2. That's what I'd say right now. This changes over time. Cresselia was really good in the past, but not so much anymore. And then for Trick Room, your win conditions, they're going to be slower and bulkier. So Blood Moon, Ursaluna, and Ursaluna. I'd say Blood Moon is probably the best Trick Room wall breaker at the moment. But yeah. Uh, and I'd say just one closing figure. Just the type balance. I've touched on this many times, but that's really the heart of team building is the right team balance, making sure you have switch-ins to everything. Fire, Water, Grass Core, Steel, Dragon, Fairy Core, that works as well. Yeah. And then, of course, uh, specific archetypes. I guess I'll do a rundown here. So, like Rain, things you want to keep in mind. You want to have Arcalodon, your Rain setter, either Pelipper uh, or Politoed. Uh, Pelipper, more helpful for speed control. Politoed, a little bit bulkier, has tools like Encore and stuff. Uh, Both of these are viable. Pelipper might be slightly better, but I personally prefer Politoed to like its higher bulk. So that's something to keep in mind. Arcalodon to take advantage of Electro Shot. Probably a water type attacker. You can run Palafin, Palafin Hero, Strong Wall Breaker. POW, Steel types in general benefit from the rain. So generally with weather, think about like the defensive benefits you'll get from the weather. So if snow, you want to run two ice types for the snow boost. Rain, you want to run water type for offense, and then use the rain for defense, like run grass types, steel types, bug types, not really bug types, but you get my point. Uh, hmm. Bulkier setup teams. When I'd run with this, I'm just mentioning Sinistcha plus Galarian Moltres because I think this is an archetype all by itself. So stuff like this, you want your bulky mods, Redirector with Sinistcha here. Oh, that's another mod that can redirect. Forgot to mention Rage Powder, also usable. Amoonguss, Sinistcha. Uh, yeah. And so then your damage mitigation, etc., etc. Uh, Sun teams, another weather. You're using Sun more offensively, so you want to use the Photosynthesis mods that benefit from the Sun. Gouging Fire, Raging Bolt, Roaring Moon, Walking Wake. Those are your Sun abusers. Yeah. Um, Psy Spam, Deoxys, and DD +4. Always run Tailwind. Again, anything that's not Trick Room, run Tailwind. It's absolutely necessary, and you probably want to run Prankster Tailwind. Although on a Gold Gear team, you can run Roaring Moon, boost your energy, Tailwind, etc. Yeah. Hmm. I think that's mostly it. Regards to things I'd like to fit on every team. Kind of covered everything. Uh, but it's also important to know these rules are not hard and fast. Many good teams are not going to follow all these things, but generally following most of them is a good way to start. And that's going to really help you in the long run. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about items briefly before we do anything else. So, best items, I'd say, for boosted energy ones, typically booster energy, Gouging Fire, Raging Bolt, uh, Roaring Moon. They're going to be able to use booster energy very effectively, um, and that can really help a lot of the time. Usually for booster speed, although Raging Bolt will use it for booster special attack to just deal a little extra damage. Uh, Choice items, not always the greatest in DOU. However, there's some mods that they work on, such as we had Dragonite on that other team. Uh, Specs can work on Goldango. Specs and Scarf you usually see more with Trick. The move pools overlap more. So if you're running like Specs Goldango, you always run Trick, because tricking the Specs is always pretty nice. Stuff like that, yeah. Um, Other items, leftovers, pretty good on bulkier mons. However, if your Pokemon is not sitting on the field 4 turns or more, run Citrus Berry. It's a very solid item. You don't have to worry about item clause. Citrus Berry is very good. Um, Stuff on redirectors, it can be really nice, especially on Sinistcha. Then your Pokemon like Tornadus, things that don't want to be faked out, but you don't want to dedicate your Tera to it, you run Cloak. Um, this is a very strong item. Also helps against Snarl, but mostly for fake out. So this is generally for tailwind centers, I'd say. Um, and there's other use cases for it. Like I've run Cloak Volcarona before, so I could like set up freely with Overdance. Life Orb, not really as good. You only really see this on stuff like Lando Eye, because it has Sheer Force and avoids the Life Orb drop from all of its moves. Hmm. Other items, AV, very good on Pokemon like Rillaboom, pivots. Not as good on Instant because Parting Shot's broken. Um, Sash is good for your frail ones, uh, POW, Deoxys, etc. Uh, Other items should I cover here? Boots, see that occasionally in DOU. This is a good item, but I wouldn't say in this particular meta I'd recommend using it. Rocky Helmet's pretty nice as well. This is pretty good for. I've run it on Instant a few times, run it on Torn. Another good fake out disincentive that has other applications. Can break focus sashes and stuff. But generally, I think Cloak is better most of the time. Um, Power, that's only on like Glamora, pretty much. Meteor being Pokemon. Yeah, that's mostly it. Um, Clear Amulet, stuff that doesn't want to be intimidated. You can always run this item. This is pretty solid. You sit this a lot on setup sweepers. Yeah. Other things you can consider, if you're running Rillaboom and like a setup mon like Chiyu, you can run Nasty Plot. One of my favorite sets. Grassy Seed Nasty Plot. Helps with your bulk. And so those are pretty much the items. The order I covered them is kind of like the order of like how good they are. Grassy Seed's only pretty niche on a couple mods, but it's a solid item. And that's most of it. In this gen in particular, one thing I will note, you don't really run resist berries very much, or the weakness berries, whichever you want to call them, uh, because you can tear out of those matchups anyway, and you generally want your item slot for one of the broken items like Clear Amulet, Cloak, or etc. Assault Vest. Assault Vest, depending on the metagame, could be a lifesaver. This metagame, it's not really as necessary. It helps with Deoxys, but like in the past, we've seen metagames where AV is really good, and I wouldn't really say this is one of them. But it's still a very good item, but it's not like one you run like multiple of on every team. Hmm. What else? Yeah, I think that's mostly the items. Um, yeah, I think that's mostly it in regards to what I wanted to cover in this video. Went over the resources, how to build, like the process of building a team that I would go through. Things you want to keep in mind. Terra, EV, uh, hmm. I guess I'll go into like how you want to test your team and modifying. That's something. It's kind of like the scientific method, I guess. You build your team, you test it. Uh, so a good way to test it's always ladder. However, you're not really going to get good games until like 1500 or 1600 on ladder, because before then you're going to be facing mostly people who are not using good teams. And again, if you're testing your team, you want to test it against good teams. So you can always ask for test games in the DOU room. There's usually a fair number of people on, or in DOU Court, the DOU Discord. Um, Usually a fair number of people on there that are going to be willing to play games. Yeah, so that's how I test. You kind of just be like, watch out for things that are giving you trouble. An important thing to note with teams as well, oftentimes it can be like a team style difference. Minor changes that don't really affect the way the team plays can be very helpful for making sure a team like fits with the way you like to play. For example, changing an item, um, changing an EV spread, making something faster or bulkier, depending on your preference, can be really helpful. Yeah, that's how I advise testing. If you're a more serious tour player, of course, and if you ever get into playing tournaments, it can be helpful to play an alternate account, but other people don't know. I learned this lesson when I first started playing DOU. Make sure you're not being obvious about who you are, because then people will counter team you, and that's never fun. It's not a fun way to lose. So yeah. Also, room tours. You see those once in a while. Can always ask someone who, like a moderator or something in the DOU room, to start a room tour for you. Uh, and then that can be a good way to test teams. The room tour player base can generally be pretty good. You'll get some pretty good players in there that play in like actual tournaments. And yeah, and of course, using these teams for tournaments. Smogon, great place to find tournaments. Obviously, the way to find DOU tournaments. You won't find them anywhere else. So keep an eye out on that on Pokemon Showdown. Um, and every time a new tournament will be is up, it'll be announced in the DOU room. Um, that'll be a chance for you to use your teams, right? Yeah, I think that's mostly it. Hmm, let's see. Trying to make sure I don't forget anything. This might be cut out of the video if I don't remember anything. Yeah, that's mostly it. That's my guide to how I would team build in SV doubles OU. Hope you enjoyed. Hope this was helpful. I'll see you next time. Bye.